to order. I'm going to reverse the order on the agenda and move public comments down to the after 6, simply because we want to be sure we get through these things. As most of you know, we have a regular scheduled orientation or information meeting scheduled at 4:30. The first
So you need a vote to
vote,
amend.
get a vote.
vote to move the public comments till the end of the meeting.
So moved.
So moved. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Very good. We can go down into finance. Gail, maybe you would, there you are, Gail. I just got back from the eye doctor and everything's a little blurry. So anyway, anticipatory note, which I guess we are not having this year, but go ahead.
This is a line of credit. There's no opportunity for arbitrage this year because of the tax change law, the interest rate for taxes rate for corporations dropped from 35 to 21%. So it made it more beneficial for them to invest their money elsewhere. So we don't get the arbitrage, but they are giving us a investment rate of 1.55%, which will, if the Fed's rate goes up by 25 basis points, our investment rate will go up by 0.15% effective the next quarter. So I only got the one bid from Peoples. They gave us a rate for the 6-month or a year line of credit. I took the 6 months because usually after we get taxes, we're okay. So the rate is 2.30 for 6 months. We can, I won't draw on it till we need it.
Right.
So we can take 2 advances a month of over 50,000, anything over 50,000. It's up to 3.8, which we won't need.
That's good. Just for information, as most of you know, that the school fiscal year ends at the end of June, and we start our new year the 1st of July. And we don't receive any funds from the taxes, other taxes that are due to support the school until we actually get that money in November sometime, right?
Well, it either comes November 30th or December 1st. So
Right,
usually,
end of November. So in order to run the schools, we need to borrow money to meet our expenses, and that's what this note will do. So we'll sign it. And Leon, would you like to make a motion?
I'd like to move that we waive the reading of the note for the approval of the amount of indicated at a 2.3% for 6 months. So,
it's 2%
did I write 2.30?
for
Yes.
for the 6-month
For 6 months is what
that
I-
we would just take advances as needed. So
Very good.
Right.
So a motion not to, do we have a second to that?
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor? Aye.
there's
So-
3 places to sign.
Right.
Little stickies. Sign here stickies. So
So
Okay.
I can-
pass it over to Amy and just sign them and pass them on. Yep, very good. We sign them. Treasurer's report?
Would you like me to go through it?
No, is there anything in that report that is noteworthy that we should be aware of?
No, I think it says on the agenda that it's April, but it's actually May, so you can, if you have any questions. We ended the cash balance for the end of May is about 10.7 million, but we still have to pay off the tax anticipation note. We still have the lumps payroll, so we'll end the year maybe 3.5 to 4 million.
Good. Very good.
I'll move it.
Have a second?
Second it?
Any discussion? All those in favor of accepting the treasurer's report signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any noes or abstentions? Very good. We can go to the budget status report. It's just for your information. The Finance Committee met earlier to go over a few things. Paul has submitted, or has had 2 bids submitted for the paving work at the middle school. His recommendation and the recommendation of the Finance Committee is to approve the awarding of the contract to Weaver Excavating in the amount of $125,067.50.
$67.50.
Very good.
I'll move that.
And you have a second?
Second.
Any discussion on that? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Paul has also indicated to the Finance Committee that there are several projects that he is investigating having to do with mostly security and lights and that sort of thing. These, if in fact we follow through and do some of those, he'll bring those to the Finance Committee, and the Finance Committee will bring them to the board, just for your information. The last thing is that during the summer, there are always a number of projects that are undertaken that are part of the budget. And in order to do that, we have to sign off on them. And I'm asking the board's permission for either Leon or myself to sign off on those projects. Once again, those projects are incorporated in the budget and will not exceed the budget.
So moved.
Do you have a second?
Second.
Any discussion on that? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, opposed or abstentions? Are there any other issues that would like to be brought before the Finance Committee section of the agenda? If not, we'll move on then to the consent agenda. Fran?
I'll move it.
Do we have a second? Do we have a second?
Second it.
Any discussion on any of the items listed in the consent agenda? Very good. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed or abstentions? Very good. We go on now down to policy. Leon, do you want to, or Dave's not here, or Amy?
Amy's not, oh,
Well, Amy's right here. We're down at the policy.
you want to talk?
You want to talk?
No.
Okay, I'll talk, to cover that. Policy number 70, oh, yes. Policy 7100 is a board member education policy, and this is a new policy that we're bringing in in light of a lot of communication things that I've heard throughout the town and at meetings and being in reference to being transparent and being informed, and to try to make sure that board members operate at these boards very efficiently. So we put in place, in SVSU, we explained that there's particular things, a particular attention that will be given to board goals and performance in the following areas. And we talk about policy making, community relations, board interpersonal communication skills, physical budget management, instruction programs, labor relations, board in-service training, and government relation types of things, ethical and legal requirements. We feel that it is our responsibility to make sure that all of our board members are best informed by knowing these types of things, and that we start this type of educational program to help all of them. And we've given that responsibility to start initiating that in this policy with the superintendent and the chair of the particular board that may ask for one at a time to be done during the course of the year, but we're trying to get through all of those. And the goal here again, and I wanted to make sure everybody who started at SVSU, is to make sure that all of us are thoroughly informed on the functions and the understanding and the workings of how boards should work and how we should be proficient in taking care of our business. And that's what this policy is all about.
Okay, do you want to take them separately, Leon?
I like to, yes, we can, because this is the first warning of that at the MAU, and so I'd like to have a motion for that. If you-
So moved.
Do you have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion on it? If not, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed or abstentions? Hello, Nelson.
Staying, I didn't get the discussions.
Well, you did it at SVSU anyway. So the next policy is up for adoption, and that's policy 7300, public participation at board meetings. And that has been through all of the boards and back to SVSU. Went through the warning process, and the adoption process is now back for for us to look at and adopt. So I'll take a motion to.
So moved.
Have a second?
Second.
I just have a question. Do you run this by our attorney to see that this conforms with statute?
All of our policies that we run through, we go through them, and we have several attorneys, people, individuals on the school board, on the policy committee. But the way the language is written is such that we need to send something to our attorney to review it. We do that along that line.
And was that done with
And
this?
so this particular policy here, in terms of board, I believe that this one did go through that process because it was a lot of conversation about board members to,
We've had so many discussions on this issue that I would feel more comfortable if I knew that our attorneys had a chance to go over it. Is that
this policy has been in the works, yes, for going around and so forth along that line. And what I'm saying, we have Bruce, we had League of Paris, and we had our own, Mount Anthony. But when we first started this policy came down and went through that scenario with our attorneys. I'm quite sure of that.
Well,
Okay? Public participation at board meetings, because we had quite a bit of discussion on what kind of participation we wanted and how to do it.
I
And
can
we had-
remember in our conversations at the policy committee that there was conversations about the attorney's views, input on the policy.
but which attorneys are those?
I'm
No.
just saying that
We had Fisher and Page do this way back. And look at
I
that.
know, it's just been such an issue for a long time. I'm not being critical, I just think that it does make sense. We're gonna have a meeting after this meeting that's gonna go over that.
Yep.
I would feel comfortable if we have them take a look at it sometime. I don't mind approving it, but I think that, we ought to take a good look at it to be sure that
They
it's...
can look at it again if you want to. It's
Yep.
it's part of their contracted duty to look at these particular
Right.
items, and so as part of their fees that they do for us.
Okay.
But I know we had quite a bit of conversation and review with them because of all the things that were going on in line of public participation.
Well, we can certainly ask them
But we
during
can
our
ask them
meeting
again.
later.
Was
Nelson.
your motion made already?
Yes, the
Yes.
motion has been
I'll
made.
make a motion to amend it with the approval of our attorney.
Very
I
good.
want,
That
I don't
means
know
they
who
get
made-
to review it.
Yep.
well, I don't know, I'm just trying to see how to do that and put the stipulation on that you,
We've approved
Require-
it. If the lawyer says yes, it's done.
Right. Yeah, I think it just makes sense to do that. Okay.
Okay.
Do we have a second to the amendment, to the motion? All in favor of the amendment, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed or abstentions? Now we can go back to the original motion with the addendum to it. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed or abstentions? So just to be clear, what we're doing, we're approving it with the stipulation that the attorneys have looked at it and find no conflict with statute. Okay, everyone?
okay.
We can move on then?
Do we pay the attorneys for every time we call upon them, or do they get it in the stipulation?
I don't know how that
You
goes.
pay quarter-hour rate every time.
But in the defense of something like this, it's cheap if
Oh, I'm not-
we have to go through a
I
legal
wasn't
process.
objecting to the.
Yeah, we don't have a retainer with them that we get
Leon,
so many hours
sign
as
that.
part of that
Pass
retainer.
it
It's
on.
billed from this one.
Well, with Montpelier changing laws every other week, we need to go to the attorneys to tell us if we're still on the right track.
Okay,
What we need to do is make sure that we prepare documentation with the board and with all of our constituents. And if there is a reason for doing that, we send those on to our attorneys to have them look at it. We don't just do it automatically on every one of them. There need to be something that somebody is saying that we need to have reviewed to make sure that we are not violating something out here.
Okay. Leon, we have the next, an update on the administrator's contract. Yeah.
The administrative contract is still going on. We have a meeting that scheduled for the 25th of this month, in which we would be continuing to try to resolve certain things. I think the banner did a pre-op synopsis of what we've taken place and what has taken place at this committee up until this point. We've not finished everything, and we're still negotiating certain things, and so that hopefully on the 25th we would be able to come to a complete agreement on all of the things in the contract. We wanted to try to make sure that at this meeting we have the formal contract and the language put in place so that it'll avoid the mistakes of have someone interpret something as being approved, and then we send it off and get it typed up and come back and somebody said, no, that's not what I wanted. So that's happened several times, and what we're trying to do is make sure that we have the contract right in hand with all the language put in the right place so that everybody can look it over and make sure it's right before we move on.
Thank you, Leon. Any questions, Leon, on that? If not, I'd like to spend a minute or so, a brief comment on the meeting that took place last night that I think was informative to all, and I think I appreciate Dave's running of the meeting. I thought it went as well as it could be. One of the issues that I think that we should recognize is that the public wants to see or have some response to some of the questions that were asked, clarification. And Jim has agreed to work on that through the banner. Jim, do you want to go over that, or want me to keep on going? Or what?
I didn't agree to do it through the banner. I'm sure we'll
Okay.
consult the banner, but yeah.
Okay.
We did, I'm compiling all the notes that all the different administrators took last night, and we're meeting next week once the students leave on Friday, and we're going to attempt to answer most of the questions that came up last night in a concise, to-the-point manner as much as possible. And I'm sure it'll be the banner, and what other ways we'll get that message out. We'll explore all our options to make sure that we answer as many of the questions that came up last night.
In a concise way. Then the other thing that we're doing is, as you know, we have a new principal coming in as of the 1st of July. And many of the decisions that will be made about the future direction of the curriculum, the grading and that sort of thing, I feel very strongly that he should be part of those discussions. And it'll take him a while to get the facts and talk to the people involved to get the difference of opinion. And then we can, we will arrange some sort of meeting. I talked with Dave Durfee. This really falls under the preview of the Education Committee, and he's very much for that. So basically, we are going to have a general clarification of issues that will be made available to the public on those issues, on those points that were brought up, and it will be concise. It will be to the matter involved. As we go on through the summer, we will be meeting with the appropriate people to get a better idea as to how we want to approach things that haven't already been decided. We have so many things that have already been decided. Yes?
Question: if the new principal doesn't like integrated classrooms, is there going to be sufficient time to unintegrate them? If that's, in other words, if our schedule's all set right now, or?
Well, no, I talked to Dave Barrio about that, and I've talked to Jim too. There's plenty of wiggle room. Actually, the schedule is done, but kids can be moved from class to class, as often happens during the summer and even during September when people go through there. I don't want to presuppose what Mr. Nixon's opinions will be and how he sees it. But there are certain things that we can definitely say, and what Jim is going to do is to make it crystal clear as to what's been decided upon and which direction we'll be going forward on those issues that were brought up last night.
I'll attempt to make it crystal clear.
Well,
You know, it's going to be interpreted by everybody differently, which anytime we make a response, it could create more questions, and we will continue to. All I am pledging is I'm going to try to answer as many of the questions that came out as possible and continue to answer and meet and work with people and the new principal. So.
I was going to say, a lot of things didn't come up, and what the board responsibility is out here, and we hit on some of these things, we have a balance to, we first have a requirement to graduate everybody against some requirement, and then we have finances associated with that. And then we said we're going to do everything for every kid, we're not going to lose any, and we're not going to let any fall through the cracks out here. And so we have to do an act of dumping and doing this. So when you come out and say, well, I want to have one stream here and one stream over here, that may not be the right thing to happen in a public setting for students. And so there's avenues for everybody. And so we're going to do the best job possible to do that and be financially unconstrained in the process of doing that and be very efficient. The cost of education is going up, the student enrollment numbers is going down, and the property taxes is going up, and everybody is saying, give me everything. Somebody's got to give something.
okay, any other questions? If not, I'll ask for a motion to observe. We got,
Oh, yeah, public comment.
public comments, I'm sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
Public comments, anybody like to make a public, yes? Just identify yourself, please. Yeah, go ahead, you're up.
Hi, I'm Jean Connor, a resident of Bennington. I have one quick question about the policy 7100, which I didn't think of till right now. Does that policy deal with social media use by board members, and that may not be a good idea?
Social media is a separate policy.
Okay, by board members?
The media policy that we're putting in place that was, I'm going against one of the things. I'm trying to make sure that, public comments, I hear the comments and somebody
Sure.
will reply that
Yeah.
the response didn't have a back and forth conversation along that line.
Yeah.
So you can state what you want somebody to.
Basically, what I think
No.
is the point is that public comments are made, and the board then will respond to you in a timely fashion.
That's fine.
Yeah, so I think I understand your question, and he'll respond to you in a timely manner.
Great, okay. And if it isn't included in this policy, I'm just wondering if it's included in another policy, that board members should be very careful about their use of social media.
Okay.
That's all. I just wanted a clarification. So were all the board members of Pownell, Shaftesbury, North Bennington invited to attend the training session this afternoon? Or did they know about it?
The mandate that we had was to hold a meeting for the MAU board.
I understand that.
That's what we did. I'm not really sure, to be honest with you.
Well, if they weren't, and I'm kind of assuming that they weren't, I think it's really unfortunate. It would have been, why wouldn't the district have invited everyone to attend this meeting? It's really, really unfortunate if that didn't happen. However, I'm thrilled it's being taped, and hopefully it will be made available to all board members to watch.
Very good, thank you. Are there any other public comments? If not, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So you're actually not adjourned, because this is warned as all one meeting.
All one meeting.
So you can take
We can take
a recess.
a 5-minute recess.
There you
So we'll
go.
start
Make
our-
my so moved. How's that?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll make an introduction. We're fortunate this evening to have two representatives of the law firm who represents us in many situations, Sitzer, Blades, and Fletcher. We have Bob Fletcher here with us and Joe McLean. They will be running this presentation. I spoke very briefly to them. I guess they've got a PowerPoint presentation as well as some information to pass out. So Joe, Bob, who's,
Well, I think Bob's going to take the lead.
okay?
I will fill in as needed with.
Very. Both these attorneys have been associated with the school for many years. Joe, how long ago was that we were working on the middle school?
John Murray. When was the middle school?
And it was well before we actually started building it.
Probably 1998.
And then the lawsuit over the land.
And the lawsuit of the land and all the rest. And Bob's been working with us for many years with the CDC and a couple sticky situations.
Yeah, yeah. I don't get down to Bennington as often as I used to, but I like it when I do. I'm glad to be here.
All right, the floor is yours.
All right. Did everybody get one of these sets of documents?
We didn't.
If you have a couple extra, back
I've
here,
got 'em.
be good. Richard, you.
Sure. So, the open meeting law. Everything you wanted to know and maybe some stuff you didn't. So let's start from the most basic proposition that I think is relevant to this, and that is, excuse me, the open meeting law is a codification, it's a law, of the principle essentially captured in Chapter 1, Article 6 of the Vermont Constitution, which is essentially that all public bodies or agencies exist to aid in the conduct of the people's business and are accountable to them under that provision. So whenever I think you approach an open meeting law issue, whether it's a notice issue, or it's an attendance issue, or it's executive session, or any of those things, it pays to have in mind at all times that the principle of the law is that the body that you are participating as a member of is responsible to the public. So the principle is that the law promotes open attendance, open access, and you'll see in the second slide is basically a quote from the Vermont Constitution that talks about that principle. So the default should always be open your meetings, conduct the people's business in public, and keep good notes about what you're doing. That's not to say that all meetings are always open, as you well know and you will hear about later on. There are some things that public bodies and agencies like this school board are permitted to do outside of the public eye, in part because the law has balanced the interests and determined that it is in the best interest of the public that some things happen in closed session as opposed to open session. When I say things happen, Renee, you're a lifesaver.
That's important.
All right.
Here, but we can leave that there.
No, I'm not going dancing, I'm just going to sit here. So hopefully that'll work. All right. So let's just, oh, look at that. Renee,
Is that?
thank you. So, the law, the legislature has balanced the interests of the public and the interests of the public in a larger sense, not just those who are in attendance at a meeting or may be interested in attending a meeting. But it's made a balance and determined that there are certain things that you can talk about, and in fact, there are some actions you can take in closed session. Because it's better from the public perspective that you do that rather than you have that discussion in open session and you either disclose confidential information, or you waive attorney-client privilege, or you somehow give what's the polite way to put this? You give enemies of the state information about your safety strategies, or your child protection strategies, or you are, if you're having a debate in this room in public about what your response would be to an active shooter situation, or what your response would be to some kind of civil unrest, you're giving a roadmap to the forces of evil that defeats the benefit of having the conversation. So if you think about being in or out of executive session, in a deliberative session, out of a deliberative session, etc., those exceptions exist for a specific purpose, to serve a public good, a broader public good, than actual participation by members of the public, or attendance by members of the public in a meeting like this.
So Bob didn't say this by way of introduction, but I think that this would be a more effective presentation if, rather than our talking at you for 2 hours, if we introduce some ideas. If you have questions, feel free to ask questions. I am going to try to comment on things that Bob says, or things that he may have left out. So let's try to make this a more interactive dialogue, because I think the open meeting law may get very dry very quickly unless we're talking with each other. And so, sort of summarizing what Bob has said so far, there are some constitutional principles that underlie the open meeting law. There is a general rule that meetings are to be open to the public. And then, as Bob mentioned, there are both exceptions and exemptions from the open meeting law. And it's important to understand and to try to avoid confusing those things that are exceptions from those things that are exempt from the open meeting law altogether. So, with that said, all of you may continue.
Any questions?
Yes.
All right, fire away.
Bullet number 4 under the basics, a public
Yeah.
body shall electronically record.
Yeah.
I don't know that we're doing that now.
Okay. This is a public...
Does that mean video or a voice
No.
record or?
Voice. Doesn't mean video necessarily, but you've got your CATV record, right?
Not at some meetings.
That's right.
Okay.
And understand that that bullet is specifically intended to primarily address situations where, for example, you have a state rulemaking that in which there is a process for public comment. So when they make reference to 3 VSA 840, that's a part of the Administrative Procedures Act. So that
in a
may not be
rulemaking
applicable.
In a rulemaking context, as opposed to general conduct of business.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
You might have to explain what rulemaking is in terms of,
Policy,
yeah, just in terms of a school board versus a state agency, the agency of education.
Rulemaking would be I think I walked in earlier on a consideration or discussion about possible policy development where there are competing interests in terms of do we or don't we. There are certain things that you need to have in place and some things that are not required but are best practice. And in a state context, the state is required to have a public hearing on all rules, which is not applicable, doesn't translate well to a local board. So you all have policy discussions, but the state has very specific rulemaking requirements. And they have a public hearing process.
Yeah.
They take, recorded testimony.
Okay,
They
I
then
understand.
deliberate about that, and they come out with a rule.
The end result is that the state rulemaking process, if followed, can result in rules that have the effect, or force and effect of law.
That's why there's a more formal process for that. All right, so fundamentals. What is a meeting? It's defined as a gathering of a quorum of the members of a public body to discuss the business or for the purpose of taking action. It's important that you satisfy both one and either 2A or 2B. Because otherwise, it's not subject necessarily to the open meeting.
So Bob, if the whole board showed up to see a school play, that's allowed?
That's allowed?
That
It's not a
doesn't break-
meeting.
Right, so because sometimes people get unclear about the fact that a whole board can show up somewhere for a function, but it doesn't fall under a meeting, a gathering for the public body, or...
Well, it's not, yeah, it's fundamentally not a gathering for the purpose of 2A or B, which is to discuss the business of the public body or for the purpose of taking action.
Right.
If you're gathered for a social event, you're at a football game, a lacrosse game, you're at a school play, you're somebody's Christmas party.
Training sessions fall into sometimes.
Training sessions?
Here we're at a training session.
This is a public meeting, because even though technically you're not here for the purpose of taking action, you're here to discuss the business of the public body. So I would always, going back to my original point, which is default on the side of openness.
Bob,
Yeah.
my name's Rob Duncan.
Hi.
I'm a lawyer, so I might actually have questions
Sure.
along those lines, so just to warn you. And I might be jumping ahead here, but there was an act or a law that was recently passed that's going to go into effect July 1st. And I believe that is changing the definition of meeting to include some and exclude some other aspects. Am I right in that?
Yes, you're right. Act 166 used to be H910. As enacted, it's Act 166. And it made some changes to the definition of meeting, but not significant. It clarified that social gatherings are not meetings.
And it talks about serial communications.
It was,
If I-
as originally drafted, it talked about serial communications. It no longer does.
Okay.
As enacted, it does not speak to that issue.
Thank you.
So in other words, let's say after this meeting is over, we're all meeting out in the parking lot. What does that constitute?
Well, what are you doing, Fran? You just hanging around? or-
Talking back and forth. So I'm asking you, as it's been for the last 30 years, we go out in the parking lot, we talk about something maybe that we talked about in here. So what does it constitute?
If you're talking about the business of the public body, and you're gathered for that purpose, and it's more than a quorum, you may have issues.
Or at least a quorum.
Yeah, or at least quorums. And my advice to you will always be, if you have doubts about it, don't do it. So, does that help? Doesn't help?
It's fine.
It's fine?
That's fine.
Okay,
Question,
So,
yes.
if it's everybody, don't do it, but can I talk to Fran?
We're going to get to this in a minute.
Okay.
But that's okay. No, that's fine. That's fine. Joe opened the door. He's going to have to do some lifting here. But the two of you are not a quorum. The two of you are not a majority. And if this board were to have weighted voting, so it's one person, the purpose of it would be to serve one person, one vote, so that there's a weighted voting. Then you get into the tricky mathematics of figuring out, is there a majority of the voting capacity participating? Not just body. It's not a body count at that point. It's how many votes do we have standing here around the water cooler. So simplest way to think about it is, let's just deal with a simple quorum. You got 13 people. You got 6 of them standing around the water cooler. You guys can do anything you want, within reason. Remember, it's a public water. But if you get a 7th person from the board, and now you're starting to talk about, should we do, I think we ought to, what about so-and-so? Now you're drifting over that fine line. Now you've got a quorum gathered, and you're discussing business of the public body. You're not taking any action, presumably. But at that point, you've got a problem. So you want to, you want to be careful about how many there are and why you're there and what you're doing.
Okay, one other question. If you
Sure.
did it by telephone, to
Yeah.
get certain members to vote for certain things,
Or email.
yeah.
So that's what, you can gather in person, you can gather electronically, you can gather telephonically. This question about serial communications is one that has been an open question in Vermont, which is the reason why I think there was at least consideration of some legislation around it.
Oh, yeah.
It has been problematic, and an issue we've wrestled with for a number of years is when you have serial email communication by a quorum or more of the members of the board communicating about the business of the board. And you have to make a determination about whether or not those serial communications or those, as opposed to say a reply all, constitute a meeting.
Clarification of Joe's statement. We wrestle with it only because sometimes our clients bring those circumstances to us, and we have to advise them how we interpret the law. From our perspective, with or without any amendment to the open meeting law, proposed or not proposed this time around, serial email is very dangerously close to communications outside of a public meeting. If there's a thought about doing it, don't do it. Stop doing it.
There is no Vermont
Decision.
case law, decisional law from the Vermont Supreme Court, but there are decisions from other jurisdictions that go both ways on whether or not you have a gathering for the purposes of an open meeting law violation. So the best approach is caution. And of course, the corollary to these discussions about email is that even if you don't have an open meeting law issue, you may have a public record issue, and you certainly have a discovery issue if your communication became the subject of litigation.
So here's the fun part. This is where we get to ask you questions. And Rob probably knows the answer to this, but I don't know if anybody else will. Anybody know what a hub and spoke conspiracy is? Rob knows.
I'm a prosecutor.
See? He would know what a hub and spoke conspiracy is.
Sounds like something Washington created.
No. Listen. This was created long before Washington thought about it. Basically, you've got one person in the middle and spokes on a wheel where all the communications flow out from a central location and flow back to a central location. It's not serial. It's not a serial email, right? One guy, one gal sends out an email that says, I think we should fire Bob Fletcher because he's a, blah, blah, blah. You put whatever you want, fill in the blanks. Listen, I've heard it all. And that goes out to everybody, and everybody replies.
You mean it goes out to everyone individually, it's not a group email?
Right. It's not a group email, but even if it is,
Yes.
you could do it that way, but you can send it out individually and everybody replies back,
Same effect.
same effect. It's essentially conspiracy, federal racketeering. Rob,
And if they
explain that.
don't reply, although that's still out there, that means it's null and void, correct?
If it comes out from the center,
Right.
I think the safe argument is it's an attempt to gather electronically for the purposes of conducting business.
Okay.
It's a problem.
All right.
Don't do it,
Yeah, right.
all right?
I agree, yeah.
Now, if, you know, Dave wants to lobby Fran while they're fishing or they're whatever, you know, on the phone, understand, you should understand that the issue that, or the bill that Rob asked me about originally, H910, was originated with the Secretary of State's office. And H910, as drafted, had some very stringent limits on, for definitions of meetings, what you could, what you couldn't do, what qualified, what got you in trouble in the OML and what didn't. And it was the product, according to the Secretary of State's office, of their being called on a regular basis by citizens and in some cases members of boards complaining about fellow board members or board members in general. I'm not talking about school versus municipality, it doesn't matter. At the Secretary of State's office, a lot of those complaints are about state actors, state agencies. But it doesn't matter in what context, because the law applies across the board to all public bodies. And the complaints they hear, because they don't hear about the stuff that happens correctly, by definition, they don't get feedback on what's done right, they only get feedback on what's done wrong. And the feedback they're hearing is, we have a problem with serial emails, we have a problem with hub and spoke emails, we have a problem with, you know, lobbying. And the way the bill was originally crafted, things like that telephone call from Dave to Fran or back, you know, if it then led to another phone call to another board member, they would want to put an end to that. Ultimately, it never got out of the House that way, it never got to the Senate that way, and it's not enacted that way. But be aware that these complaints are out there. People are aware of these things and they're not happy about them, and they shouldn't be. Efforts to circumvent the OML are not good things. Now, you know, there are
I got
inadvertent problems. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
You used the term, I'm going back in term meetings, and then we talk about gathering of a quorum, members of the public body. What about all these subcommittee members, meetings that we have and want to do things out here along this line? In terms of, I mean, it may be a couple of us that go out and have a subcommittee meeting to discuss some things to come back. I mean, there's no action to be taken. It says public business, but the quorum problem I'm dealing with when it's three of us. Is it because we three of us from this committee went somewhere else to work? And is that three now becomes the number that you got to have 2 or 3 out of something?
How many are in the
line?
subcommittee then?
Well, it depends. They vary, and that's why I'm trying to make sure we get some clarification out here in terms of I mean, there may be some other people from another board coming along that line, but I wanted to make sure that meeting just didn't be interpreted as the main body meeting that we're talking about here. We're talking about any meeting that's formed that you say a public body. I mean, that you discuss public business. And so I'm just trying to make sure that we clarify what they all are.
Okay.
Okay.
It's appointed, it has to be a subcommittee appointed by a larger body.
By the
If
body.
3 people walk away,
That's not a
it's a committee, that's not a subcommittee.
And generally, the law's not real specific on, the open meeting law is not real specific on this, but take a practical perspective. If, excuse me, if the high school is turning 10 years old, and this board wants to celebrate that 10th anniversary, and they ask for citizen volunteers to be on the celebration subcommittee. And the celebration subcommittee is tasked only to come up with ideas for how to celebrate Mount Anthony's 10th anniversary. And they don't have the authority to spend any money. They can't make any binding commitments on behalf of the Mount Anthony board. They can't fire anybody, they can't hire anybody. They're a tool to gather information so that you all can make a decision. Are we going to celebrate? And how are we going to celebrate? Because that subcommittee doesn't have any capacity to make decisions that bind this board, the argument would be that committee's not doing any public business. So it's not covered by the open meeting. It's not in a position to lock this board down or to commit this board to taking any action or doing anything.
Okay,
Does
so
that help?
I'm going to take it even a step further.
Okay.
And, the reason I'm asking this is like, we have a policy committee,
Yep.
SVSU, and we purposely meet to gather information and get it together, and then says, I think we got enough of it together right here, we've sent it out to the boards to vote on. But each one of the boards in the district has the vote to say. We don't vote to say at a subcommittee no more than we think the language is right, enough to pass on, and it may not be right, but we pass it on. So what constraints are we all under at that level? That's the one we're grappling with, because we do minutes, we do all kind of things, and we have the same agenda as a full board meeting that's going to vote on it and approve the items that we gathered information on, and yet we're not covered. Basically what you're saying to me, that we shouldn't be doing it that way.
But you're a committee of the SVSU, so you're an official board, and you warn them.
I just want to make sure
There's no electronic recording though.
I have a question about the email and telephone communication.
Sure, yeah.
There are times, for example, when you're hiring say, a superintendent or a director, where 2 or 3 people that have been to a series of meetings might be having a conversation electronically about their observations of the different candidates and so forth. Is that supposed to be part of a public record? Because normally you would meet in executive session and have a discussion about which candidate you're going to recommend for the board to take action on. But you have a preliminary discussion sometimes prior to that.
And the discussion is occurring only by 2 or 3 board members, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it could be, or you might, if it's an email conversation, there might be
we don't want you to
copies
come
going on.
away from this with the idea that board members can never talk to each other about the business of the board. You can, but you need to be mindful that there are multiple components to this definition of what is a meeting. And you have to always be thinking, are we dealing with a quorum? Do we have a quorum of the board here? Have we somehow gathered a quorum of the board, and are we talking about the business of the board? And if you do, then you have a meeting. And if you then fail to take the other steps that are necessary to have a lawful meeting under the open meeting law, then you may very well have a problem. So just like even though, and I'm not holding your board out as being different from any other board in the state, but you adjourn from your meeting, and you go to the parking lot, and then a group of people gather around and continue to have discussion, shop talk about whatever you just met and discussed. It's probably not a great practice. And it's really, once the meeting has been adjourned, that would be a good time to talk about the game last night, or where you're going to go to dinner.
Even though the entire subject would be, what would you conduct in an executive session anyway? Where it might be about real estate or a contract issue or a hiring.
We'll talk about executive session, but executive sessions don't just happen spontaneously. You need to take certain steps to go into executive session and make certain findings at times to go into executive session. So the fact that a subject may be a proper subject for an executive session wouldn't necessarily authorize the conversation by a quorum outside of a meeting, and outside of that process of taking the steps that you need to take.
I mean, let's look at the slide that's up here now. A meeting is not communications in person, by email, telephone, or teleconferencing between members of the public body to do these things. In other words, the law says this is not a meeting. To schedule a meeting. Hey, are you available Thursday? No, but I am available next Tuesday. And you go back and forth about that. You're not doing anything other than administrative work. You're trying to schedule a meeting. You organize the agenda. Can I get, somebody's got a pet peeve about dog policies or something, and they want to get that on the agenda. So they're lobbying to get it on the agenda, put it in the front end of the agenda. It's organizing the agenda. It's not a meeting. Right? Or you have material that you want to distribute in connection with an upcoming meeting. The distribution of that material is not a meeting. You get into trouble with respect to the OML when you start to debate, discuss, deliberate, talk about the substance of that. If all you're trying to do is organize yourself for an upcoming meeting, it's not an open meeting. It's not a meeting at all.
And again, this assumes there's a quorum.
Yes. Right. And then you've got, the occasions that were brought up earlier, social gatherings, conventions, conferences, training programs, media events, press conferences, provided you don't discuss the specific business of the body. The last one, Joe tells me, is confusing the way I wrote it, and I apologize. I don't know. Did anybody find it confusing? No. All right. Which is you.
Can I ask about the first part where you talked about communication? I'm trying to get this spoken wheel in my head. If I'm the chair of the board, I send a message out to every one of my members asking them if they can meet.
Not a meeting.
Not a meeting. If I send them agenda items, not a meeting as long as they don't discuss it.
Yeah, so long as somebody doesn't write back and say, why are we wasting our time with that? I hate that idea. The board, no board should ever consider that. Now you're starting to get into the substance. Okay? So spoken hub on all these things. Go ahead.
Yeah, that was my concern.
Yeah.
Because I do that sometimes. I'll send something else, say, can you meet at this date?
Fine. Do it. Do it. Call them all up.
And the last bullet is...
the one that Joseph finds confusing. Let's see if he can explain it.
Not the last one. The distribute materials. You can send everyone the PDF of the consultant's report on the school. You just have to save discussion of that report for the meeting.
I can't send out and say, I noticed in the financial report that blah, 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 was correct, let's discuss this at a meeting. That's discussed.
Correct.
Right.
All I can do is send a report.
Right.
Or characterize the consultant's report as a waste of money and a piece of crap. Don't do that. Just send out the consultant's report and you can deal with a piece of crap later. At the meeting. All right, so attendance at a duly warned meeting, there is a typo. You're right.
There is a typo.
Of another public body. As long as the first body takes no binding action. So you can go to a select board meeting, all of it, en masse. It's not a meeting of your body, as long as you're not trying to take action. Okay? What if you have joint meetings? You warn both meetings to meet jointly at such and such a time, such and such a place, agenda. Then you can both take action. It's a lawful public meeting for both. Understood?
In that sentence, which body is the first body?
Thank
That's
you.
the-
That, see?
That's the
Jesus.
problem.
You guys are giving up. It's the first one.
So us.
Yes.
We go to the select board meeting.
Right. The select board can do whatever it wants because it's engaged in a duly called
That's what I
meeting. They can take whatever action they need to take.
Can I just make a comment? I'm actually on the select board, and we do meet jointly, but it's not a publicly warned meeting, and we both make sure we never have a quorum. So the select board never has a quorum there. The school, actually, it's mostly the administrators, school board members are, Tim usually goes. But anyway, that's okay, right?
Yes.
It's not a meeting. It's not a, there's not a
There's no
gathering of
quorum,
a
and it's
by the
not-
body.
And it's not publicly warned.
It's not a gathering of a.
Okay.
But you
Quorum
could
of by the body.
conceivably
Okay.
have a joint meeting where
It's
both
publicly
bodies
warned.
warn in the meetings.
Yes.
And you could have a select board meeting where the school board members attend.
Right. Okay.
That happens in some other community where they want to get together quarterly at the bodies, the boards. And so they each warn a meeting and for the same date, place, and time. They come together. They each convene the meetings. They have whatever discussion they're going to have if they need to take action. They generally have a shared agenda that says school board action, town action, done. They both adjourn, they go home. Everybody gets to make a record of it.
Now, let me ask you this. If you were to,
Whoa, 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 whoa.
Rather, I'm going to ask him a question. If you could conceivably have a situation where one body was invited into the meeting of another body, where they both warned a meeting, and then one moved to go into executive session.
Yes.
Would they be able to invite the second body into the executive session?
Ah,
I would say no.
right, so there's one no. Anybody yes?
I'm not a lawyer, but just from
You
how
can.
that's going to be.
There's one yes, one no?
Well, if it's a joint meeting to discuss a common issue, I would
Invite
think
them.
they would all have the right to be in that
So a
executive
situation I can think of is you're in litigation in a land use case, the select board or council opens a meeting, they invite the development review board to the meeting to get their feedback, and you want to do that in executive session because you're in litigation. And the question we recently struggled with was whether both bodies had to move to go into executive session or only
independent.
one.
Well, the safer way to both parties.
Sure.
So we've covered this.
Gather.
Gathering. Coming together, electronically or telephonically. So, just because Joe's made me gun shy about my semantics, a non-attending member would not be one who is absent and unknown. A non-attending member would be one who is not physically present at the meeting. So you all could meet, with the exception of, honestly, all of you. You could all be you could all be non-attending members. As long as you have a location designated as the meeting place, you have electronic communication capability so that you can all hear and be heard. You can literally conduct a virtual meeting. Now, better advice, have somebody here. I mean, you have to have a staff, at the very least, a staff member or a representative of the board present. You can designate that someone on the staff to do that. I think that's a hard, it would be difficult for the public to appreciate the benefit of doing that. I think you're better off if there is someone here who can attend, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you, whatever, and the rest can attend electronically. I mean, if you had an emergency meeting on Christmas Eve, for some reason, you can speculate. But the point is, you can do it. You can do it telephonically. You can do it electronically, but you have to be able to hear and be heard. And you can, your vote, all your votes, all your action items have to be taken by roll call. So there has to be the clerk saying, Smith, yes, no, Jones, yes, no, Peters, yes, no, Okay? It requires a roll call. And as the note says, non-attending members have to identify themselves, and they have to be able to hear and be heard. Sorry.
So if the board was in executive session and they came out, and then they called the 7th or the 12th member of a board and said, we're gonna, there's a motion on the floor, how do you vote? Is that person able to participate?
Can they hear and be heard?
Well, is that person able to vote if they didn't hear the discussion in executive
Can
session?
they hear, can they be heard, and can they hear the discussion?
Of that present moment, yes.
And
They can just vote.
as long as there
I thought they
is
had to hear
as
the
long as there is a
deliberation.
quorum, and that at the initiation of the meeting, and that quorum is not lost, that meeting is still going on. Someone could show up late to that meeting. It
I
happens.
always thought that they had to be part of the deliberation in order to vote on the motion.
Well,
In a quasi-judicial context, that may
Yes.
be the case.
Okay.
but you're talking about an executive session, which is not deliberative. It can't be. They're two different things.
Because
We'll get-
deliberative, you don't vote.
Deliberative is,
No.
it's not a meeting. It's not covered by the open meeting law. A deliberative session is something outside the open meeting law. It's one of the exceptions that Joe was talking about. So if you're, I think you may be confusing an executive session with a deliberative session, and we'll get to the distinctions between those when we get there. Okay?
Just, I actually hate the phrase deliberative session because it's so easy to confuse with executive session. And I always think of an executive session is an exception to the open meeting law. Deliberations are exempt from the open meeting law, and that's sort of that's one of the areas I was talking about in my initial comments, trying to be able to sort of clearly distinguish between those things.
So, a meeting is a meeting, unless it's something else. So a meeting can be a regular meeting, it can be a special meeting, it can be an emergency meeting, and it can be an adjournment meeting. The distinctions amongst those four categories are important to keep in mind. All right? A regular meeting is held on a regular basis, and typically the same day or days of the month, first Thursday, second and fourth Tuesday at 6:00 p.m. All right? It's something that typically is established at your organization meeting. There's a motion made to hold our regular meetings on these days, at this time, in this location. That helps establish for you and for the public an expectation as to generally when your meetings will occur. What day, what time, what place. That doesn't mean that they can't be changed, but it means that that's the expectation. So if you're going to change that, you want to make known a change in sufficient time so that folks can accommodate. They can go to a different location, they can show up earlier or later, or the Tuesday meeting's going to get canceled and we'll meet on the fourth Tuesday. That's generally done, as I said, by resolution of the body. A special meeting is one outside of the scope of a regular meeting. It's something special. It requires time, place, and purpose notice at least 24 hours in advance. And the posting requirements you'll see at or near the municipal clerk's office, in this case the superintendent's office, the supervisory union office, and at least 2 other designated public places, at least 24 hours before the meeting. And notice is to be given orally or in writing to each member of the body, unless someone says, don't worry about me, I'll just look on the website. So unless somebody waives that right, you have an obligation to try and reach out and to tell those folks that we're having a special meeting. So why do you have a special meeting? Generally because there's something that cannot wait for the regular meeting, or it's a unique kind of situation that you want to address outside of the scope of the emergency meetings are just that. They are for emergent situations that require action now. The obligation to notice is as much notice as you can give. So there's an active shooter threat, there is a hurricane or a tornado bearing down on the property, who knows, there's a water leak. Pick one, something that would be an emergency in your life, probably qualifies as a supervisory unit emergency. It's not to be abused. It's not an excuse to hold meetings on short notice or no notice and circumvent the open meeting. It really does require an emergency. And you have to be able to articulate that probably at some point if you're challenged. What was the emergency? Why couldn't you wait until Monday, your regularly scheduled meeting? Or why couldn't you hold a special meeting on Saturday and give everybody 24 hours notice? Well, if we waited past Friday, we were going to lose $12 million. Or we were going to, somebody was going to abscond with all of the AV equipment, whatever the emergency is. But you need to be able to articulate. It can't just be because I thought it was kind of important. Probably not.
Rob, in terms of notification of special meetings or any of those other meetings, you have down here the municipal clerk's office and 2 other designated public places in the municipality. Could you be a little more exact about that? In other words, if we were going to have a change of time of our regular meeting, if we posted it on the website, if we posted in the banner,
Notices here.
and we had put a notice up on the board here, would that constitute?
Tim, where do you advertise when you have
It's in the paper.
non-voter of warning?
It's in the paper.
Paper, but you have to put it up in public places. You put it at the post office?
No,
You put it at the corner store?
no,
Do you put it at the grocery store?
no.
It gets emailed to.
It gets emailed to a lot of people, but we don't actually post it in any of those places. We should.
Find yourself a couple of public places, like the post office, where a lot of people go.
Although the post office sometimes raises issues with
Yeah.
posting, but you can post it.
But if we took it
The
down to the
supermarket.
municipal office, we could speak to someone, we could post it there, we could post it
The libraries.
Yeah.
the
Clerk,
library, something like that.
Yeah.
A
A lot of small towns do it at the grocery store, because a lot of people go to the grocery store to get gas.
Dave, do you,
We do it at 2
in Powell, I mean, in Strasburg, do you post it?
And it wouldn't hurt to do it in the same place that the select board does it, just so
Okay.
it establishes, again, an expectation.
So
This is
when
where
you're
we look
talking
to
about
say-
posting it, you're actually talking about posting it.
Right, it's physically
Thumbtacks.
posting.
Okay,
I mean, putting it on the website, you should do anyway.
right, I understand that, but I.
But that doesn't get you past this obligation. You
Okay,
should-
and that would occur whether it would be a special meeting or emergency meeting or any other meeting that didn't fall at the regular time.
Yeah.
Now, if we have a regular meeting, would that also be posted physically in those places?
Yeah, you have an obligation to do it 48 hours in advance.
Okay, and that would still be in those places that we mentioned?
Yeah.
A physical,
Yeah.
as well
You
as...
can do it, I mean, you can do it here. You can find a couple places like the town clerk's office,
Okay.
you know?
Yeah, I understand.
Bob mentioned, taking practical steps, and one thing that I've seen come up on a couple of occasions with municipalities through the years is, for some reason, the room that has been identified in the notice as the location for the meeting can't be used. It's unavailable, it's been given to someone else. You need to hold the meeting in a different location or at a slightly different time, the same day. Typically, the way that is dealt with is from a practical perspective, you put a notice right on the door, and you station someone at the door for some reasonable period of time, so that if someone shows up, they can be redirected. Sometimes it's as
Go to the
simple as something
library,
like
go to
that.
here, go to there.
Very good, thanks.
All right.
Sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Just looking back at the regular meeting notes here, and then maybe I'm just confused about this particular point, but does it need to be, it doesn't say that it needs to be warned 24 hours in advance for a regular meeting.
It's 48 hours.
Okay, did it, so I missed that, I guess. Okay, regular meeting.
Post the agenda at least 48 hours in advance. Sure.
Now, you as a body have made a motion that your meetings will always be on this day, at this time, this location. And that gets posted.
Yeah.
And you're saying that even though it's already posted, you have to post it every week if you're having this?
You post the agenda. Right. I mean, theoretically, when you adopt your resolution, that's going to show up on your website. Your website's going to reflect when your regular meetings are being done. You're going to have minutes that reflect the decision, and then you're going to post an agenda 48 hours in advance. And the agenda typically is going to say, you know, MAU, school board meeting, regular meeting, Wednesday 4 p.m. or Wednesday 8 p.m. or whatever, whatever time it is. So when you put the agenda up, there's yet again another notice to the public.
Yeah, I know that we did send the agendas for the local school where I am electronically by fax, and we put it up on the town board. I don't know if they put it up, do you put it up on the board here as well?
Yeah,
So it's
I would
all-
imagine they do, yeah.
So practically speaking, there really isn't a distinction between giving notice, as you typically would do for a special meeting or an emergency meeting, where you just, within the required time, state the purpose of the meeting, its location, its time, and posting the agenda, which may be somewhat more elaborate, but is effectively the same thing. You're going to have the time and date on the agenda as well, and location.
What are the requirements for public access to where it's posted? For example, let's say you decide you're going to have a meeting on Monday and it's a holiday weekend, and you send out the warning on Friday, so you've got your 48 hours before the meeting, but the town clerk's office is locked up until that Tuesday, and people technically don't have access to the posting unless they go to a website or hear about it some other way. Have you met the requirements of listing warning the meeting?
I think you would be better served to take the affirmative effort to post it in some other place. If you knew, for instance, the town clerk's office was going to be closed, I'd find 2 other places. I'd send it to the town clerk and ask them to post it, but
Yeah.
I would also say, okay, but let's go the extra mile, because we're here to serve the public. Let's make sure the public knows we're going to meet. Let's do this.
Okay, thank you.
I would go the extra mile. And again, it comes down to what we call Law 18 in soccer, common sense. Use common sense. And if the notice you're going to send out is going to go to a dead box for 3 days, technically, have you met the requirements? You may have. But do you want to have to fight about that on Wednesday? No. Take the time, post it a couple of other places and get it over with. And you can say to folks, look, we did what we could. We knew the clerk's office was going to be closed. We put it here, we put it there. Proactive. Okay, adjourn meeting is like a meeting that started but never ended. If you adjourn to no specific time, Robert's Rules of Order has a special title for that. But the point is, if you don't pick a date and time, all you've done is adjourn the meeting, and you need to warn a new meeting. If you say adjourned to Friday, June 22nd, 5 p.m., You don't need to re-warn the meeting, because this meeting is warned, and the action taken during that meeting tells the public when the next meeting is. The adjourned meeting will be reconvened. So you don't need to post and go through all the process of publication, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You need simply to make that motion and decide before you vote on the adjournment that we're going to reconvene such and such a time, such and such a place.
So adjourning without specifying it.
It's just adjournment.
It's just closing the
It's
meeting.
closing the meeting, you're done. And then if you want to meet again, you've got to re-notice.
So is there a particular situation where the public might be well served, we as a board might be well served by adjourning to another date? It's not a practice that we have regularly used.
Technically, you can adjourn a meeting at which there is not a quorum present under Robert's rules. So if you're missing one member, but you know that member or another 2 members can be available 2 days later, you can make, it's proper to make a motion to adjourn to that later date and time. So that
you don't have a quorum.
you don't have a quorum, but Robert's rules permits you to entertain that motion. Okay, so remember, you're subject not only to the open meeting law, but to Robert's Rules of Order by state statute. So Robert's rules say you can make that motion is proper even without a quorum present. So I've seen that happen. A meeting's called, it's important business, you get there, and so-and-so's plane was late, so-and-so's car broke down, whatever. And it's still important that action be considered and may be taken, and you don't want to wait another 2 weeks. If your cycle is 2 weeks, you don't want to wait that long because it's important that it get done. And you know that so-and-so's car will be fixed or their plane will land in time for a meeting 2 days later. You adjourn to that 2 day later time. Done.
So what happens to the agenda on those items? I mean,
It's still the agenda.
the same agenda. You can't amend
Everything's the
it.
same, Leon. It's just like you bent time. So that what was going to happen tonight happens 2 days later. It's the same meeting. All you're doing is just shoving it down the calendar 2 days.
But we can't continually do that. I mean, if I say schedule a meeting and I'll load it up the agenda, and I'll get in there and I'll do 2 or 3 items and says, okay, next month I'll pick back up on this and keep going. So I can't do that.
No, because you probably have a regular meeting in your 2-week cycle before that anyway. There may be things you don't get to tonight or tomorrow, or whenever your next meeting is.
I think I've served on zoning boards in the past, where we've taken things and taken information for making a decision, then we've adjourned to a later date, because that's when we will make our decision and finish it up. So we're telling the parties that are there, we're adjourning to this date. Is that not simply what you're talking about here?
It is. That's frequently the context in which I've seen the adjourned hearing process used, is where you're acting in a quasi-judicial capacity, like a zoning board.
Or think about it, you probably sat on the BCA. The BCA meets, they hear from the taxpayer, they hear from the listers, and they say, we're going to send out an inspection committee and we're going to come back together 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now. And then we'll decide whether Joe's house is really worth $1 million or it's only worth $150,000. Right? It's the same idea. Agendas. So now we're going to have a meeting. Agenda. If someone asks for an agenda ahead of the meeting, the body must provide it when it becomes available. Pretty standard practice. I'm sure the superintendent deals with that all the time. This is important. Additions or deletions should be the first act of business. Should do that. You should get everything that is going to be on the agenda, either by original publication, adds or deletes, done as the first item of business, rather than adding or deleting later on. And then moving items you know, we have the Boy Scouts coming in for recognition, and they're all here. Let's move them up to number 2, so we make sure we get to them, and they can go home and do their homework, go to bed. Those kinds of things. Practical considerations. Right?
And
Those
how
can
is,
be made at any time.
and how is that done? Does that have to be a motion by the board? In other words, if we're going to move an agenda item from one spot to another, can the chair just do that, or does it have to be voted on by the board to move it?
Generally done by consent, Tim. You know, I've seen lots of boards where somebody says, I got to get out of here by such and such a time. I really want to be heard on on this subject. Is there a chance we can move it up? Everybody goes, sure, that's fine. Boom, done.
So you don't need a formal vote in that case if there's a consent.
What about to add an item?
If you want to add an item,
Well, you said any addition or deletion. Is that by consent, or is that a vote? The practice that we have taken on is
Generally by
actually
consent.
voting.
you've been
Yeah.
active voting, that's fine too. I mean, the more.
Right at the
formal, better.
beginning of the meeting before.
Yeah, and you vote yea or nay to add something to the agenda.
Can you add something to a special meeting, or are you restricted to what you warn on the agenda?
That's a different situation. In that case, I would say you're stuck with the agenda you published.
Yeah, that's the practice we've been trying to use, okay.
Then you've been doing fine. Because the expectation is that is all you're coming together to do, is what is listed on that special agenda, and they don't expect you to turn that into a Christmas tree with a lot of other ads.
And
But
the
that
same
doesn't
with,
apply to a regular meeting?
No, because things can come up, and ultimately, as I said at the beginning, ultimately, the open meeting law is about a balance between the rights of the public, whom we all serve, to observe and understand what business is being transacted. But it's also the practical side of transacting the people's business. And if it's practical to have the people's business transacted tonight as opposed to 2 weeks from tonight, if it makes good sense, it's not a violation of the open meeting law to put that on the agenda. Because those folks who are interested and concerned and present at that meeting understand, this is the agenda and it may change. So, reasonably inform the interested public. Now we get to the interesting stuff, which is public comment period. Boards do this different ways all over the place. Some have public comment at the start of the meeting, others have it as the final agenda item so that all of the board discussion has occurred, and then folks can weigh in on what they've heard. And some boards allow very interactive exchanges with the public on everything. I mean, I have seen boards debate amongst themselves an action. Yes, no, I think it's a good idea, I think it's a bad idea, whatever the discussion is. And then they ask the public if they have any thoughts on it. Almost as if the public were another board member. And, it's the opportunity to speak is provided to the public in the open meeting law. The mechanics for how that gets done is really up to the chair. It's not intended to be an unlimited period of time. It's not intended to be discourteous, disrespectful. It is supposed to be, it's intended to be civil discourse about the people's business. So to the extent that there are lots of folks who want to be heard, it's appropriate for the chair to say, with all the folks that we have here tonight, we're going to limit the conversation, the public speaking piece, 2 minutes each if we can. Please don't repeat what other people have said. Try and add new substance when you get to the microphone. Tell us who you are. Tell us what you have to say. Thank you very much. And it's your responsibility, Tim, at the moment, to keep that moving, to keep it courteous, disrespectful and not, finger pointing and argumentative. Try and make it true civil public discourse.
You're not required to open up public comment to any potential subject, though. The statute provides it's on matters considered by the public body during the meeting. And the matters to be considered by the public body during the meeting are presumably those matters that are listed in the agenda. So if someone comes in and wants to comment on something that's wholly outside of the agenda, I suppose the chair has discretion on whether or not to allow that. It sort of falls within the reasonable rules provision of the statute.
If a discussion on an agenda item is taking place, excuse me, after public comments, and a member of the public wants to comment on that, should the chair recognize that person, or is it up to the discretion of the chair to do that?
I think it's the chair's discretion. I mean, if the public comment period has run its course,
Right.
there are no other folks to be heard from, and then you move on with your business. Depending on how long your agenda is, how long you've been here, what people's schedules are, whether you're going to be able to get to all of the stuff that you need to get to.
It's really up to the chair then to recognize that person if he or she feels that the appropriate other business can be
Yeah, I
taken
mean, I
care
got 554B up here, which says basically the school board shall afford a reasonable opportunity to any person in the district to appear and express views in regard to any matter considered by the school board. That it's a reasonable opportunity. You have a responsibility to manage the people's, to manage the board to get the people's business done. And if you think it's a light agenda and it wouldn't be too bad if, a couple of minutes were spent in that, and it's an important topic, you don't want to, tamp down public discourse too much, you can allow it. If you think, however, that if it's matters that you imagine you have already heard, or views that have already been expressed, and that speaker or those speakers have had a reasonable opportunity to express themselves, then you're within your rights to say, we had a public comment period, it lasted, 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it was, and if you have anything further you'd like to offer, we'd be happy to take an email or provide it in writing or something.
I understand.
It's reasonable.
Yeah.
It's a reasonableness standard. There's no hard and fast, 37 seconds, only on this issue.
Bob, just one
Yeah,
thing on the comment. So the requirement is for the public to make a comment, which would not necessarily be responded to by the board, correct?
Correct. It's not altogether an interactive process. I've seen it done that way. I've seen a lot of give and take.
That was my next question. There's nothing precluding the give and take, correct?
No.
If the chair wants to do
Unless it's in your policy.
No, but if the chair, the chair can, in the same way that the chair can say to the public, this period is closing, and, is there anybody who hasn't spoken that wants to speak? Da-da-da. The chair has control of the meeting in the sense that they're able to say to the board, we can't spend all night on a back and forth, can't have an interactive process all night long, because ultimately, you're here primarily as volunteers to do the public's work, and you're all giving your time to do this, and you need to get bills paid, you need to get staff hired, you need to get policies adopted. There are substantive things to do, and part of that is to take in information from the public, but to a certain extent.
So, for instance, earlier I asked a question. I thought it was a simple question that may have been able to be answered immediately, but instead, the board chose to not answer it, and they're going to get back to me within 30 days. So,
the state law doesn't prevent that. Jim mentioned
right, I
there's a
understand that
policy.
that's fine,
But we're doing it right now because this is an open meeting.
Well, yeah,
So-
the chair right now could say, the board is the only one in this discussion session, if he so chose. And
Right.
you wouldn't be able to speak.
Right.
But but he's allowing it. And that's the same as when you ask the question, he'll make a determination when's the best time. He could have said, Leon, if you got the answer, give it to her now.
Right.
Or he can say, we'll get to you in 30 days.
So-
But that's the chairs.
Am I allowed to continue to speak?
That's the chairs.
Well, I don't know.
So,
Reasonably, real
I didn't
short
get an
time.
answer to my question. So what's your interpretation of the amount of time that the board has to answer my question?
Well, so this, Bob, 554B says that you have, that the board is supposed to provide you or any member of the public with a reasonable opportunity to express views. And the open meeting law in 312H similarly says that you have to be given a reasonable opportunity to express opinions. There's nothing in the statute that obligates the board to respond to your views or opinions or to do so within a particular period of time. I mean, as a practical matter, boards frequently, because they work for the public, seek to respond to issues and views and opinions that are raised by the public. But I think the answer to your question is I'm not aware of any statutory time period in which they are required to provide a response.
But
It is in there.
Well, I guess if you basically requested something in a Freedom of Information Act.
That's a different issue. I don't know. I have no idea what your request is, so I'm not.
No, I'm just saying,
speaking very
if
generally.
Jean had sent to Jim or Tim the question in a email as a Freedom of Information Act or a written letter, then they would have had 30 days to respond.
And again,
But that's different from the public.
Shamari, the Freedom of Information Act, or the Vermont Public Records Act, it, in the most general sense, authorizes members of the public to inspect and copy public records. It does not obligate a public body to provide information, create a public record, or provide verbal information in response to questions. And so,
Right, just records.
Right. If there's a record that's being requested, then the public body, whether it's the select board or a school board, would be proceeding under the Public Records Act with whatever the time frames are that are provided in the statute.
We ought to stick with the topic that we're on.
Sure.
Right.
Can I ask just a follow-up question? It's been the practice of the board and of the public, I think, to use public meeting time to bring to the board's attention matters that are not necessarily on the agenda. And which sounds like legally we're not obligated to hear, although maybe we're encouraged as a practice to hear. But if that's not the best opportunity for the public to bring to the board's attention a matter that is, has reached the point where the board is the next step, is there another avenue, or should we not?
So does the board have an agenda item that says other business or something to that effect on it?
Yes. Yeah, so that covers catch-all.
There's nothing that precludes that. And I believe that if I'm correct, there are some statutory limits on the ability of the board to take action with respect to matters that are being raised under other business for the first time. But beyond that, the board can certainly have that on its agenda and hear from the public during that portion of the meeting.
All right.
So we've been advised by your firm that we shouldn't have other on the agenda, that we should be specific about what's on the agenda and not, so.
Well, you shouldn't use other as a catch-all, as a whole in which to bury items. If you've got legitimate business, you should put your legitimate business on the agenda. And you can add to, because you can add to the agenda.
You could add to, okay.
You could, instead of
So
having.
you could add by
other business-
consensus, but not, because we don't.
You could have, instead of your other business, you could add to the agenda. It's come to my attention, we need to deal with X.
Okay.
Instead of, in the past, it used to be there was always the executive session as needed and other business.
Right, those are gone.
Those are gone.
Yeah.
You should just you should focus on trying to get an agenda that reflects what it is you're trying to do in that meeting, subject to adding and deleting as we talked about.
I'd like to revisit Dave's question about public comment and if the public is coming to the meeting with a comment about something that's not on the agenda. Are you advising that not be heard?
I don't think we're advising that it not be heard, but you don't have, your first order of business out of the blocks after you convene is to modify by adding or deleting to your agenda, correct? If you get 2.5 hours into your agenda and someone says, I want to talk about what a poor job you're doing with paint on the building, and it's not on the agenda, your time to add or delete has come and gone. You can't then add that item to the agenda.
Oh, sure.
For action.
Right, no, I'm not talking about for action.
Okay.
Okay.
But if someone says you're doing, you're lousy painters,
Yeah.
okay, thanks. I'll take it up with the superintendent.
Yeah. Right.
But it's not something you can act on because it's not on your agenda.
Yes.
And you haven't added it to the agenda.
Right.
So it's
But you're simply asking about how does the board hear concerns or issues that members of the public may have?
Correct.
So that the board becomes aware of those issues and then potentially can put them on a future agenda or act on them at some point in the future.
Right.
And I think you can hear about them through the public comment period. You could...
Emails.
Other communication.
Other communication. You could potentially hear about it through some type of other business type of agenda item if that is something that you have. There are boards that have very specific agendas, and trust me, there are still plenty of boards out there that have agendas that say other business, or that say new business and old business. So, right? There are ways for this information to come in.
But that was a good example about what I said earlier in the policy meeting, that that one of the policies that were up was a result of what I've heard in the community and other places, and thought it was prudent that we put together and have something on our board to discuss pertaining to what board members should be doing and knowing and so forth. That's how I get a lot of my stuff.
All right. 30 seconds on meeting minutes. Matters of public record. Available for inspection 5 calendar days from the date of the meeting.
Richard?
Even if there's a Saturday, Sunday, and a holiday on a Monday, and another holiday on a Tuesday?
What if we have a
Overtime.
minute taker who takes very detailed minutes? Now we're getting to the next slide.
That's right.
Minutes shall cover topics and motions that arise, give a true indication of the business. Who's there? Members of the body and active participants. So get folks drawn up to the microphone, identify yourself. The scrupulous note taker can write it all down. Motions, proposals, resolutions made, offered, considered, and the disposition. What happened? The results of the votes. What happened? It's like writing a newspaper story. Who, what, when, where, why. You don't need, and it's a huge mistake to try and craft a verbatim transcript of what happened at the board meeting. It is a huge mistake. Because inevitably, if you start down that path, you are going to misquote, misstate, or drop altogether something that somebody said. And then you're going to get, why did all of that get in and my piece didn't get in? You're better off with Mrs. Smith wanted to congratulate the Boy Scouts. Unanimously approved. We passed the warrants. Did this, did that, Keep it simple. Keep it to the bare bones. Who was there? What did you do? To the extent you need to, why was it done? And at what time? Boom, 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 out. Because transcripts are a problem. They're a problem for the clerk to generate and a pain in the back end to generate, and they create problems for the board in the future. Keep it simple.
Do we pass around a sheet for people to sign up to? Is that statute, or is that just a good practice?
No, that's just good practice, you know. Yeah.
Well, it may help you to identify active participants in the meeting.
Right.
But we would ask anybody that was addressing the board to identify themselves.
Yeah.
So we would certainly.
That makes
have
them active members. I mean, if you have a sign-up sheet, a lot of places do that, Tim. They have sign-up sheets, and it's everybody that's there.
Okay.
And 92% of those people don't want to go to the microphone. They will never go to the microphone, and they don't care that their names appear in the minutes.
Okay.
The other 8%, you better get them in there. Yes, sir.
I understand what you said about the requirements for details in the minutes, but going back to your third page there, the basics, where it says public body shall electronically record all public hearings, etc.
Your minutes are your minutes. What you're required to have are minutes. And
Okay.
you remember that the public recording, the recording of public hearings is primarily a rule-making requirement,
Okay.
not a meeting requirement. And you're not adopting rules that have the force and effect of law.
Thank
As
you.
would Agency of Human Services or DCF or something. Okay? Understood? Now, when the public may be excluded from a meeting. No public access to deliberations, meetings for routine administrative matters, or executive sessions. So a deliberations are not a meeting in the open meeting law. You are called upon to adjudicate the rights of parties. A discipline proceeding for a student. The hearing, to the extent that it doesn't involve a minor and it doesn't involve personally identifiable information, which is highly unlikely, would be a public session. It's easier to think of this outside of the school context. Think of it as Board of Abatement hearing, where somebody says, I want to be relieved from the obligation to pay my taxes. There's no FERPA violation, there's no minors involved. It's a landowner saying, I should be relieved of the obligation to pay my taxes for the following reasons. All of that is presented to you as evidence. The taxpayer comes in and says, this is why I should be relieved, these are my financials, or these are my circumstances, or, whatever. And if there is a counterpoint to that, the listers may say, no relief is, should be granted because of X, Y, or Z. The Board of Abatement then says, thank you very much, hearing closed. We'll deliberate and you'll have a decision in 30 days, because the statute requires a decision. They go off, they can go to TGI Fridays, they can go to Burger King, they can go to somebody's house, they can go to the country club, they can go City Hall Park, they can go wherever they want. They can meet as many times as they want. They can discuss the evidence, up, down, in the middle. All of that is deliberations. They're trying to decide, should we or should we not abate the taxes? There is nothing about that deliberation that is covered by the open meeting law. All of those deliberations are not meetings. They're not open to the public. They shouldn't be conducted in an executive session because there is no executive session to be conducted because there's no meeting. It's all outside the open meeting law. Okay?
So can you relate that to school board, and how do you call the body together for deliberations?
You don't. You just get together. It's a gathering of the individuals without a meeting. It's not a meeting. There's no calling. There's no, the board members can, half of them can be in this location, half of them can be on the phone. They could get together at somebody's house, they could go wherever. All of that is outside of the realm of the open meeting. It's deliberative, because what you're ultimately going to get is a written decision that says, we find X. We decide Y.
And is that written?
That written decision
is public?
Is a public document, yes. And as you know, from your time on the board, in a student discipline matter, there typically are two decisions. One that is available to the public and one that isn't.
And just to be clear, the deliberations we're talking about here are quasi-judicial deliberations, not legislative deliberations. So we're not talking about
policy
deliberating over what the policy should be. We're talking about there has been a quasi-judicial proceeding, which is defined in the statute as a case in which the legal rights of one or more people are decided after the taking of evidence with rights of cross-examination, etc.
Which culminates in a written decision, and that decision is subject to appeal. Sure. That too. That's what a quasi-judicial proceeding is.
So you can do that around personnel.
So it could be personnel, right? And you sit in judgment. You are the judges collectively. You're the Supreme Court, and you make a decision. Not you, Jim. I'm looking at you, but I don't mean you.
Personnel and student discipline are probably the two areas that are most likely to come up in a school board context.
And you're asked to make a decision. Do we or do we not, and why? And you produce a written decision. Now, here's an interesting twist. You don't necessarily have to deliberate privately. You make a decision to deliberate publicly, if you wish. It's rare, very rare. And typically you're talking in the context in which this body would be deliberating, you're talking either about students and student records, or you're talking about personnel. But understand that provided you comply with the other laws that are applicable to those situations, it's possible. It's very unlikely that you would ever deliver in public as a school board.
As an aside, can you speak to at what point a student disciplinary matter would reach a school board level and not be handled administratively within the school?
Yeah, sure, if you wanted to expel someone.
All expulsions are
Generally,
school
yeah.
board? Oh.
Yeah, unless you have a different policy that I'm not
No,
aware of.
I'm just new. I don't know.
I mean, expulsions are school board decisions.
Okay.
I mean, the easiest is weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Automatic, theoretically.
Okay, thank you.
So meetings for routine administrative matters, day to day. No money is appropriated, expended, or encumbered, and no action is required. I put in here the list is maintenance of the grand list is easiest to think about. It's an administrative task. This school board is unlikely to have administrative tasks that it does, because it has a staff of folks that does the administrative work for it, right? I was just trying to give you an example of how that might work. Executive session. Nobody here likes executive session. Okay, deliberation. How do you get there to an executive session? Motion made in open session. So the meeting itself has to exist, has to have been commenced, has to have been initiated. The motion has to state the reason, or reasons, can be plural, for the executive session. There has to be an affirmative vote by a majority of the members of the public body present. So if you have a quorum, you have a meeting. If you have a majority of the quorum, you can move to an executive session. It's not a majority of the whole body, it's a majority of the quorum. A majority of the quorum present, the body's present.
Okay, I have a rhetorical question for you, that I'll ask you and then I'll answer, which is, do you need to indicate on the agenda that you intend to have an executive session?
You want me to answer?
Sure.
No.
That's right. I would say no, although, again, from a practical perspective, if you know you're going to have an executive session, and you know that members of the public are likely to be present, there's nothing that precludes you from indicating that you may have a possible executive session so that folks can plan, so you don't have people show up and then have to be turned away for 30 minutes while the executive session is going on. So just that, I look at it as a practical issue, courtesy that, you might want to extend.
But if you don't have it on the agenda, the rule applies from earlier that you have to add it at the beginning before you conduct any business.
What about the reasons for executive session?
We're about to talk.
All right, yeah. Nice lead-in, thanks.
What about an executive session at the beginning or the end?
What about it? I'm not
For
sure.
the public?
I'm not sure I get your point.
For the public, if there's an executive session scheduled at the beginning of the meeting, you never know when the actual meeting is going to be starting.
True,
So you never know when to show up.
true. That, however, is within the control of the body. That's their choice.
We have to open our meeting first before we go into executive session, so the meeting time would be.
Sure, the opening of the meeting will occur, but then I think the point was, what if you then go immediately into an executive session that lasts for 2 hours?
Right.
And then you've got folks sitting around in the parking lot for 2 hours. It's, as Joe said, it's a courtesy thing, but there are things that require executive session. There are reasons for getting there and staying there and then getting out of there. And there are reasons that you should do it at your, when it best serves the public business. It's the best way I can.
Before you get to reasons, can you talk about, do alternate members attend executive sessions? Alternate members to a board?
If the main member is present,
Yes, yeah,
so then there's a duplicate of members.
right. That's what I'm asking.
If there is no provision in the law that says how to deal with alternate members when the original member, the primary
Yeah.
member is present.
Okay.
We're just about to get to who can attend an executive session, and it includes anybody invited in, referenced in the motion, who are staff folks, clerical assistants, legal counsel, or persons who are subject to the discussion, or persons whose information is needed. So there's room for an invitation to an alternate member, but if the primary member is present and is going to be present throughout the executive session and whatever action there is at the other end, why would you subject yourself to it?
It's conceivable if you knew that a vote would occur in the future that where some information was needed and the primary member was not going to be there,
Yes.
you might want to have the alternate present so that they're
Got it.
sufficiently informed.
Practical. It's, practical application. So what action can be taken in executive session? Almost none. Almost none. You can negotiate and secure real estate options. That's it. That formal binding action can only be taken in open session. What can be discussed? Confine your discussion to the purposes for which you went to an executive session. If you say you're going into an executive session to receive legal advice from counsel, that doesn't give you free rein to talk about everything else. You get the legal advice. Okay? You can talk with your counsel about pluses and minuses, what if we did this, what if we did that. But once the legal advice is delivered and the questions are answered, that should be the end of the executive session.
There are some attorneys in this town that will tell you you can vote in executive session.
none of them work for my firm.
I hope not, but I'm just saying, we have had, some of us sitting here have had that told to us.
None of them work for me.
We don't retain him anymore either.
Bob, if you discuss like an individual or an employee or personnel, and you come up with a contract or a plan for them, and it's not going to be delivered by the superintendent, but it will be delivered to the board for action, does the board, the public body, have to vote on it, not necessarily every word of it, but to make a motion to accept what was discussed in executive session, or give a contract to somebody that was discussed in executive session?
And yet the engagement of public employees has to occur in open session. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure I followed the whole thing. I'm sorry. But
So, I guess what I'm saying is if any of these boards in the SU deliberate, or, meet in executive session over a personnel issue,
yeah.
come up with something other than the superintendent dealing with it, does the board in open session have to vote on what they're deciding to do with that employee?
I think, Sean Marie, you must have in mind a set of facts that I'm not following.
No, it's simple. I mean, if any board was meeting about a personnel issue.
All right, so they go into executive session to discuss personnel matters.
Right, and you
Okay.
decide in executive session that you're gonna either terminate them, or you're going to offer them something different than has previously been. Does that action that they're discussing have to then take place in open session? The result of that executive session?
Results?
You may want to check with the attorney in your office who's handling that case, so.
Well, if it's an active case, I'm gonna defer on it, if that's what's going on.
I'm not sure exactly, but.
I don't know either.
Yeah.
So for my years on the board, if you directed as a board the superintendent to take some kind of action, whether it be a plan of improvement or some kind of disciplinary action, if you directed the superintendent to do that, there needed to be no action outside of the executive session. If the board was to take action, my understanding was that the board then had to vote on whatever the conclusion came to in executive session.
In open session.
In open session.
So you're trying to draw a distinction between the superintendent being directed to do something in executive session
Correct.
and then someone else being directed to do something
Well,
outside
then
of
the board taking action as opposed to the superintendent taking action.
I mean, I'm at a loss to know whether, is that a currently pending matter? Is that
I'm not on
issue
the
currently
board.
pending?
I'm not on any of the boards.
Possibly, yes.
Okay, then I'm not going to take a position on it. I can tell you what the statute says.
What's the statute say?
The statute says that a disciplinary or dismissal action against a public officer or employee can be discussed in executive session unless they want to have it in public. Is that what? Is that
And then what does it say about the action?
I'm at a loss.
What title are you on?
Huh?
What number are you on?
I'm in 313. It's executive session.
So, unless they choose otherwise, but it's now, if the board didn't choose otherwise.
They mean the employee can have his or her disciplinary action taken in public session if they choose. So there are certain executive session subjects that require an initial finding by the board of substantial disadvantage. And the body, the school board, has to find that premature general public knowledge about the subject would clearly place the public body or a person involved, it doesn't have to be necessarily you, or a person involved at a substantial disadvantage. If you make that finding, then you can have an executive session on motion to discuss contracts, labor relations agreements, arbitration, grievances, pending or probable civil litigation, or to receive confidential attorney-client communications made for the purpose of providing professional legal services. So a finding of substantial disadvantage is not required if you're negotiating, securing real estate purchase option. That occurs in executive session. To discuss records accepted from release under the Public Records Act, but not discussion of the subject. So that they're parsing this a little bit. To appoint, employ, or evaluate a public officer or employee, but any final decision must be in open meeting.
There you
for the
go.
reasons explained. Discipline or dismiss a public officer or employee. Open session event if the employee or the officer requests it. Consider a imminent peril. Review security emergency responses when disclosure would jeopardize public safety.
So if we are requesting permission or an ability to go into executive session, do we need to quote the statute to go in, or can we just say we're going in for negotiations, we're going on a personnel matter, we're going in for whatever?
So, here's what I would advise, Tim. Substantial disadvantage, I move the board find premature public knowledge of whatever it is. We clearly place the school board at a substantial, or another person, at a substantial disadvantage because there is risk of disclosing advice, personal information, et cetera, et cetera. So that finding, that motion gets made, that finding gets found, if you will. So the motion gets acted on. The board finds that premature public knowledge of the subject of the discussion would place either the board or another individual at a substantial disadvantage. Having made that finding, it's then appropriate to make a motion to go into executive session to discuss whatever that subject is, and to be assisted by, or to be joined in executive session by so-and-so, legal counsel, so-and-so, superintendent, so-and-so, human resources director, identify,
So
who
those individuals who would be asked into executive session, exclusive of the board members, should be listed so they become part of the minutes?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what do we do if it's a discussion of a particular student and it's the parents that might be in the executive session?
You would use initials?
But
or
this
you could
person's
say
going to be identified in some fashion.
student 18-002, or parents of. Now, you have a responsibility to protect the identity of that individual, the student, and to protect their personally identifiable information. So you don't want to disclose in your minutes precisely what you're going into executive session to protect. So you may need to be very thoughtful about the motion and if you use initials, even in a larger district like this one, you might have a better chance of finding out who that, discerning who that is. Use a number. Don't say the single parent of, you say parents, you know what I mean, Rob? It's just
Actually, I'm
the same way you,
because I was struggling with that, but in some way identified but not
identified, right?
It makes sense to craft that motion in advance so that you're not trying to do it on the fly, and it's at least these areas that Bob's talking about, contracts, labor relations with employees, arbitration, mediation, grievances, pending or probable civil litigation, and attorney-client communications, they are a minimum two-motion or two-step process. There's nothing that prevents you from providing additional fundamental premises for why we're going into executive session, but at a minimum, you want to make that substantial disadvantage finding and then the motion that states that you're going into executive
All too
session.
often, boards, this substantial disadvantage finding is not new, but not old either. It's been around, but not very long. And all too often, some boards fall into the catch of making a motion that includes both the finding and the move to executive session. Split them up. It's so much cleaner. You make your finding, then you have your justification to make your motion for executive session, then you vote on that, boom. You're done. You're locked in. You can do what you need.
Should the finding involve any kind of discussion? So I move that, et cetera, second. Is it legitimate to just have a vote immediately?
It can involve, that's what I was referring to when I said it's at least a two-step process, but you could have some preliminary findings in advance of making the substantial disadvantage finding to explain how you got there.
The trick in doing that is not undoing
the purpose of the
executive session.
Right.
Because the more you talk about it up front, the harder it is to weave your way through the, through the weeds. And there are attorneys, God bless them, who are of the view that anytime you're going to get legal advice, it's a substantial disadvantage if it's delivered in public, because you're waiving the privilege. And I think that's a pretty good standard. Why you would need to make an additional finding that is the case eludes me, but that's what the legislature says you have to do. So I don't think I would, in my finding motion, I move that we find blah, blah, blah. I don't think I would say to receive legal advice about the lawsuit that we just, learned about because so-and-so fell down a set of stairs at, X facility. It's to receive legal advice. Done enough.
And that, the wording is the wording, all right, substantial disadvantage? That's the jargon that should be used.
Yeah, it's substantial disadvantage to you or another person.
Yeah, okay.
Now there are situations, for instance, one of the substantial disadvantage finding applies to executive sessions pertaining to contracts. You will sometimes hear from vendors that I want to participate in an executive session. I want to meet with your board in an executive session because I'm going to give you such a deal. I'm going to make you such a deal that if everybody in the public knew that I was giving you this deal, I'd go broke. And I won't talk to you except in executive session. So if your finding language says to receive a really good offer from Joe's Ford,
right?
He's going to sell you the pickup truck for $12,000 a pop. You've defeated the purpose of executive session.
Well, the other aspect of that is, pay attention to the language. It talks about premature general public knowledge would clearly place the public body or person at a substantial disadvantage. So if you are talking about going into executive session to engage in confidential attorney-client communications for the purposes of receiving legal services, it's fairly self-evident that if you have that discussion in public, you potentially waive the attorney-client privilege, and that puts you at a substantial disadvantage. The example that Bob gave, I've seen situations where boards have said, we want to invite Joe Smith from Smith's Ford into executive session to talk to us about the contract that they are going to offer us for those Fords. And it's hard to articulate what the substantial disadvantage would be in a situation like that. where you're inviting the other party to the negotiation into the executive session.
But some parties will say, I won't disclose to you what my offer is in public. It's just how it is.
Is there any guidance in the open meeting law to assist board members? Let's say they feel like something's being done improperly, like there's an executive session that really shouldn't be happening, or what should board members do? Is there any guidance in the law to help board members navigate that kind of a situation?
Not in the law, but in history there is. At the UN, Nikita Khrushchev takes his shoe off and pounds it on the table.
Okay, so there you go.
I object. Are we legitimately here?
Right.
And are we beyond the scope of what we told the public we were going to do here? I mean, if you go in to talk about, to receive legal advice, and then you talk about everything else on the agenda, and that's not what the lawyer is there to tell you about, you're outside the scope of what you told the public you were going to do.
So they're just responsible?
Yeah.
Personally responsible?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if they're, part of the presentation, I'm not sure we'll get to it, but part of what is in this package is a discussion about what happens if someone says, hey, I think you violated the open meeting law. You've got a responsibility to respond within a period of time, whether it's an inadvertent violation, and what follows on from that initial response, and what are the ultimate other responses. But it's a responsibility, I think, incumbent on every board member to say, hey, wait a minute, stop. I think that's too much. I think we're far afield from where we were when we came through the door. We came through the door and we turned a hard right, and now we're covering everything else. Or, in the voting, in the determination of whether the finding, whether there is in fact substantial disagreement, or in the motion to go into executive session to discuss XYZ, there's time for debate. I mean, it's a motion, it's debatable. Hey, I don't think that's appropriate, under the statute. Okay, why do you think that? Get out the statute, read it. Is it or is it not? And the board will make a decision. But there's the responsibility is inherent in each of the board members and the board as a whole to make sure that they're doing what the law permits them, and not more, not less.
We should probably talk about just the process and timelines for addressing violations.
We're going to skip the quiz. That's too bad. I really like that one.
Well, you talk too much.
You can take the quiz at home.
I've been extended that a lot. Except by my wife.
Actually, I was going to ask if you're old enough to remember when Khrushchev actually took his shoe off and pounded on them.
Unfortunately, my friend,
I am too, so.
Yeah, we should, that's right. That should be executive session. Because there's a clear substantial disadvantage to me. All right, so what if you violate the OML? The Attorney General, quote, or any person aggrieved can bring an action in Superior Court for injunctive relief for declaratory judgment. Before suit, however, the complainant must provide the public body with written notice of the alleged violation and an opportunity to cure. If sent, contact your attorney.
Little sales pitch.
I know. But you must respond publicly within 10 days, 10 calendar days. Call a special meeting. Provide adequate notice of warning. Do everything you're supposed to do. At that meeting, discuss the substance of the allegations and determine whether there was an inadvertent violation of the law. Consider executive session to receive legal advice and consult with counsel. These are not insubstantial issues. Violation of the OML can lead to litigation, possibly to legal fees.
Criminal liability.
Criminal liability.
So, and the statute actually provides now that a person who knowingly and intentionally violates the open meeting law and their violation is established shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and fined not more than $500. So there's potential criminal liability individually, and there is potential liability for costs and attorney's fees for the public body.
The reason that you want to make a timely response is the bottom of this chart. If you don't, if you don't respond at all, it's a denial. And if you deny wrongfully, you can be assessed attorney's fees.
And the reason you go through this process of determining whether or not a violation occurred and potentially identifying and admitting a violation is you can mitigate your exposure to attorney's fees. You're still potentially liable, but you could mitigate your exposure if you admit the violation and take steps to correct it within the time allotted.
And just to be clear, it's the other party's attorney's fees, not our attorney's.
Correct.
No, you get the privilege of paying both.
That's right.
You pay both sides.
That's right.
You pay one, and you may have to pay two.
And I was telling Bob on the way down here, I actually had a situation come up under this provision earlier this year where one, let's call it, public board made an allegation that another public board from the same municipality was violating the open meeting law. And so it did not ultimately result in a complaint to the Attorney General's office, but we did have to go through this process of investigating what happened. Once we had the facts, determining whether or not a violation had occurred. Once we determined there had been some irregularities, taking steps to correct. So it's and all of that was just with an eye toward mitigating liability down the road if a complaint was filed. So it can be a complex process just to deal with the aftermath of a complaint.
So do you know why you're here?
Yep.
Okay. Does the board know why they're here?
Yes, very definitely do.
Because the board invited us.
We were willing to pay all that money out.
Because condos would have done it too.
For free.
Well, it is 6:30, and that is our time limit, and I want to thank both of you for being here, enlightening us. We will review your comments and act accordingly.
Thank you.
We are in.
Thank you.
We are in a meeting, so I need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Fran? Any discussion? All in favor? Aye. This meeting is adjourned.